On today's show, Connor McMichael stopped being a promising young player a long time ago. Now the Capitals have to decide if he's part of the foundation before the price explodes.
Your Locked On Capitals, your daily podcast on the Washington Capitals.
Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Well, hello and welcome into this edition of Locked On Capitals, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Dan Holmi, and today's episode is brought to you by our friends at FanDuel. Right now, new customers can bet just $5 and get $150 in bonus bets if your first bet wins. Head to FanDuel.com to get started. So in this edition of Locked On Capitals, the Capitals have a lot of questions to answer this summer. And one of the biggest questions is the future of restricted free agent Connor McMichael. We'll talk about him. We go all the way back through the Connor McMichael story because honestly, I think people forget how difficult this development path actually was. Hershey, doubt, frustration, questions about whether he'd fully stick. Then we'll talk about getting into the season itself, this past season. The raw points tell one story, but the context, well, that tells a different one. The injuries, the role changes, the droughts, the pressure hockey late in the season, all of it matters. But where we will start in today's episode is with the money, right? The contract, the leverage, the long-term gamble, and why this decision says everything about where the Capitals think this franchise is heading. So the big takeaway here right out of the gate is Connor McMichael is no longer a depth piece the Capitals are evaluating. I think it's safe to say he's becoming a core player that they have to commit to. And I think that's the case, right? And I'll make the case, for and against. Ultimately, what version of Connor McMichael is he? What kind of player is he? Because last season, 14 goals. This season before, 26. This season before that, 18. Of course, you want to sign the player that put up 26 goals in the 24-25 season. But at the end of the day, is that who Connor McMichael is? Is the 14 goal scorer that we saw this past season? Because when we talk about the 24-25 season, there were quite a few different players that put up career numbers. And what did we see? Not all of them were able to duplicate that kind of success. Because as we get, directly into the biggest question surrounding Connor McMichael this summer, what is he actually worth? Because the negotiation is fascinating. And honestly, it's bigger, than just Connor McMichael. It's ultimately telling you what direction this team is going. Because I think this is one of those contracts that, quietly tells you how this organization views its future. Are they trying to run it back with Alex Ovechkin for one more season, or are they going to pivot in a younger direction? Now officially, McMichael enters this offseason as a restricted free agent, coming off a 2-year bridge deal that turned into one of the best bargains in hockey. $2.1 million for Connor McMichael. As we know, I think that he tracks as a great player, right? If we take a look at his history, first round pick, 25th overall, all the way back in 2019. And that's what the Capitals gave him, $2.1 million. For a player that gave them a 57-point breakout season, followed by another productive top 6 year. Of course, a couple seasons ago, he looked really good, and he didn't look horrible this past season, really poured it on. He said himself he understood that, the Capitals were kind of on the cusp or, a fringe team, if they were going to make the playoffs or not, and he knew that he had to show up, that, maybe he wasn't having the best season or the season that he had hoped for. But what did we see from him in the latter part of the season? He did pour it on. But, you talk about that $2.1 million for a guy that put up 57 points. It is, an absurd value, genuinely absurd. And now the discount period is over, right? Now you have to pay market value. right? That you're not going to get Connor McMichael on a deep discount. And this is where the debate, gets really interesting to me, because Connor McMichael is kind of difficult to project, as I spoke about earlier. And it took a while for him to stick, because I referenced his stats, but it was a bumpy road. He started in the 2021 season with 0 goals in 1 game played. The following season, in 68 games played, 9 goals. The 22-23 seasons, in 6 games played, 0 goals. Again, the 23-24 season, 18 goals. 24-25 season, 26 in this past 14. So, that's why I kind of have made comparisons to Hendrik Slop here for a while. Because it took Connor McMichael a while to stick as well. Obviously, Connor McMichael has taken his game to a level that Hendrik Slop here has not yet. And you've got one season, like I said, where he explodes. 57 points, 26 goals. Looks like a legitimate breakout top 6 forward. And you're thinking, wow, that's really good. And then, like I said, the following season, the numbers slide back to 46. And like I said, still solid, still productive. But, I think we can all agree not star level production. So which version is real? That is the entire negotiation. And, I actually think both sides have decent arguments here. If you're McMichael's camp, you're looking at his age, only 25 years old, and saying this is a player is entering his prime right now, I think would be a safe thing to say. You would also be pointing to that 57 points, saying that's the ceiling we're betting on. You're also pointing at the salary cap exploding upward. That the NHL cap jumping to $104 million changes a lot. A $6 million player does not feel like $6 million anymore. The middle class of NHL contracts suddenly become way more manageable. I think that they could get Connor McMichael on the cheap. I've also viewed him as a potential trade piece. But if you take a look at it, if you're the Capitals, you're probably looking at, consistency concerns. You're asking whether, the offense is stable enough year to year, because I guess one more season would be able to get, a little bit of a better average. You're looking at the face-off percentage hovering around 43%. You're looking at a player that would, at the end of the day, rather play center, but to end the season was third-line left wing. And you're probably debating internally whether he's truly, like I said, a center long-term or really a winger. And those conversations matter because centers get paid completely differently. But here's the thing, even if he ends up winger long-term, he's still exactly the kind of player this organization desperately needs moving forward. Because if you followed him, if you've seen him play, he is fast, skilled, transition offense, pace through the neutral zone. And the Capitals need that very badly. Because this team, for years, this team's identity surrounded and revolved around Alex Ovechkin, heavy cycle offense and veteran experience. And that formula worked for a long time, but the league has changed. The NHL got younger, faster, way more aggressive offensively, and the Capitals trying to evolve, without, tearing the whole thing down. And it's not easy. And that's ultimately why McMichael matters so much. He feels like one of the bridge players between eras, between the Ovi of yesteryear, the Rock the Red era, and the era that is yet to come. Not fully old core and not fully next generation, but, I would say, like the connective tissue between them. And now financially, there are probably 2 realistic outcomes. The first is, another bridge deal, which, if he comes back, seems likely. But something like 2 years, around $4.7 million annually. That gives the Capitals more evaluation time. It also gives McMichael another chance to push that value even higher before unrestricted free agency gets closer. So that's the gamble, right? That you sign him to the player that he is now, or if he explodes, pay him much more in years to come. But, the option feels risky to me, right? At the end of the day, if McMichael takes another offensive jump, suddenly this becomes, even a more expensive conversation 2 years from now. And then there's the long-term plan, right? 4 years, around $6.4 million annually, feels realistic in today's market. And, you take a look at it honestly on a $104 million cap, that number feels pretty fair. Not cheap. I'm not saying cheap, but fair. Especially if you believe he can settle consistently into that 55 to, let's say, 65 point range during his prime years. And personally, I think the Capitals should lean in long term if, as a matter of fact, they don't view him as a trade option. Because you need certainty somewhere. The Capitals are entering, an identity transition. The roster is changing. Veteran pillars are disappearing. Carlson, Dowder, gone. The post-Ovechkin era conversation is no longer theoretical anymore. It's starting. And then when you look around for players who can actually carry offense in the next phase of Caps hockey, Connor McMichael is on a very short list. However, where it gets interesting is the Capitals are still looking for a top six forward. That top six forward is not Connor McMichael. Could they, as a matter of fact, use him as a trade piece to bundle to get that bigger top six forward? A former first-round pick back in 19 carries some value. And, like I said, Connor McMichael is on a very short list. It matters a lot. Now there's another layer too, leverage. Because if the Capitals go short-term again, McMichael gets significantly closer to unrestricted free agency. And, once players taste leverage in this league, everything changes. I guess there are exceptions. I think for, relatively recently, I know time flies, Tom Wilson, there was a real concern. I was very concerned. If you followed this show a long time, I was very concerned that he could go somewhere else. But guess what? He's here long term. Tom Wilson, make no mistake, could have gone anywhere he wanted to. He's here. And, you take a look at Connor McMichael. If he has another breakout season that we saw a couple years ago, it's going to be tempting for him. Suddenly, that hometown discount disappears. Suddenly, you're competing with open market value. And the Capitals know that. So they believe in the player, truly believe in him. Now is the time to act. If you wait later, you might pay the King's ransom. So to wrap up segment one, Connor McMichael's next contract is about more than dollars in term. It's about belief. It's about whether the Capitals view him as a temporary contributor or a foundational piece of the next era. And honestly, if you think he's part of the future, waiting only makes this more expensive later. Coming up next, the season itself, because the numbers dipped, but the context behind Connor McMichael's 25-26 campaign tells a much more complicated story. I'll discuss straight ahead, right here. The NBA playoffs are here and every possession matters. If you're looking to get even closer to the action, FanDuel has a great offer to get you started. Right now, new customers can bet just $5 and get $150 in bonus bets if your first bet wins. That's right. Turn $5 into $150 in bonus bets just for getting started. I like using FanDuel during the playoffs because everything I need is right there in one place. You can check stats, trends, and matchups before making your picks, which makes the whole experience feel a lot more informed. So whether you're looking at player props or just following your favorite stars, it adds another level of excitement to every game. Now listen, our favorite team, the Wizards, well, they're not playing, right? But you still have vested interest with FanDuel. So head to FanDuel.com to get started. FanDuel, play your game. If you've got a sweet tooth like I do, you know how tough it is to find that perfect treat without all the sugar. That's why Cotton Candy 5-Hour Energy Shot brings that nostalgic flavor back in a whole new way. This is that classic cotton candy taste you remember, but with a tasty caffeine boost and zero sugar. It's a quick, easy way to satisfy a sweet craving while keeping things simple and on the go. If you're like me, I have always loved candy, but also if you're like me, I cannot be eating eating sweets all day, this is a perfect alternative. The flavor really does bring back that throwback fruity vanilla vibe and is surprisingly smooth. I like how convenient it is too. Just a small portable shot I can grab whenever I need a little pick-me-up. Bring on the sweetness with Cotton Candy 5-Hour Energy Shots, available online now at 5hourenergy.com or on Amazon. Don't forget to check out the Everydayer Club for ad-free episodes and access to a group chat with me and other listeners of Locked On Capitals. Go to lockedoncapitals.supercast.com. There is also a link in the show notes. All right, welcome back into this edition of Locked On Capitals, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, where it is your team. Every day, we're talking about restricted free agent this summer, Connor McMichael, and what to do. What to do with a former first-round pick that had, well, a step back last season after a career best the season before. So, segment 2 here, the big takeaway, Connor McMichael's production regressed, but his importance to the Capitals actually grew. Huh? What do I mean? All right, so let's actually talk about the season itself, right? Because this is where opinions on McMichael get really split. You know, some people look at 46 points, and they see regression. It was a step back. And others look at context, and they see growth. And honestly, to me, I think both sides are, kind of right. Because statistically, yes, this was a step backwards. The goals dropped from 26 to 14. The total points fell from 57 to 46. His shot generation dips. The shooting percentage falls below 10%. And early in the year, you could absolutely feel the frustration building, especially during that 9-game goal drought, if you guys can remember back in November. That stretch was rough for the Capitals and, well, it was rough for Connor McMichael. That was followed by even a worse December for the Capitals. And what makes it tougher was expectations had changed completely. Nobody was treating Connor McMichael like a prospect anymore. Like, you're for real, take the training wheels off, ride your bike. The breakout season changed the conversation. Now he was expected to drive offense, expected to, produce consistently, expected to be a part of the solution every game. And, you take a look at the Capitals themselves, they were dealing with chaos around him. PLD, we remember that, missed a lion's share of the season, constant injuries, line combinations changing nonstop. Is McMichael a center? Is he a winger? What is he? Veteran departures, lingering emotional inside the room. And, McMichael actually addressed some of that publicly. If you guys can remember on Breakdown Day, he talked about how the year just never felt fully stable. Stable emotionally or structurally from the start. And, hockey players are creatures of rhythm. When the environment around him gets, well, shall we say unstable, right? That makes it difficult. And production often follows suit. But for me, here's, where I think the season becomes more interesting. The coaching staff eventually moves McMichael onto the wing. And something interesting happens. Suddenly, the offensive instincts start coming back. More speed, cleaner zone entries, more confidence attacking downhill. Less hesitation defensively. And honestly, looking back on it, I think this might be the year the Capitals quietly realized he's probably not a long-term NHL center. And that's okay, right? Not every first-round center stays at center. He said he wanted to play center, and this goes back a long ways. Sometimes this skill set simply translates better as a winger, and that's okay. For McMichael, the wing may actually maximize, what he does offensively. I believe it because once the defensive, responsibilities eased up, you started seeing the creativity return. You could see the pace returned. And then down the stretch, something really important happened. Connor McMichael, if you guys can remember back, became one of the Capitals' best forwards when the pressure got the highest. 15 points over the final 19 games, in big moments, big responses. And, to me, that matters more than the middle of the season slump. It really does. Because when playoff races, tighten up and the lights get brighter and, the anticipation and the expectation increases, some players fold under pressure. McMichael actually leaned into it, and that is becoming a trend in his career right now. You saw it in Hershey. You saw it during that 57-point breakout season. And, you saw it again a year later. When the games matter more, he tends to elevate. That is a good trait. That's not something every player has, for sure. And honestly, that trait may matter more than whether he scores 46 points, or 57. Does he still need to become more consistent? Of course he does. Does the shot volume need to come back? Of course. Do the face-off struggles remain a concern? Yeah, they do. But zoom out for a second, right? This is a player that went from 33 points to 57 to 46, all before turning 26 years old. That is not a decline per se. That's growth and volatility. That's what I'm going to say. And here's a huge difference between those things here, is that, when you take a look at what he's done, you take a look at 33 to 57 to 46, it's all a part of the learning process. And I think that there is a huge difference between decline and volatility, and the situation surrounding him. I think that he's a player that's finding his way. I think that he was a player like a lot of other Capitals last season, took a step back. But big picture, I think he's a great hockey player that was able to elevate himself when it mattered the most. Was it enough? Was it enough to get the Capitals into the playoffs? It was not. But that's not what we're talking about. What we're talking about is that his game got better when the pressure was up. And to me, that speaks volumes about what kind of player Connor McMichael really is. So to wrap up segment 2 here, Connor McMichael's season was not clean, right? It wasn't dominant, but it also, to me, was not a failure. What it was a transition year inside, a chaotic Capital season. And, when the pressure rose late, he answered. That's the takeaway. If you want to walk away with the biggest takeaway, that's it. When the pressure rose, he answered. That's the Capitals. They still believe there's another level there. And coming up, the full Connor McMichael story, because the grind through Hershey and the years of uncertainty completely changed the kind of player he became. I'll discuss straight ahead right here. If you've ever opened your bank account and thought, where did all my money go? You're not alone. Keeping track of your subscriptions, spending, and bills can get overwhelming really fast. That's where Rocket Money comes in, helping you take control of your finances all in one place. It tracks all of your subscriptions in one spot so you can help cancel the ones you don't need with just a few taps. It actually categorizes your spending so you can actually see where your money's going. And I made a mistake. I went to Rocket Money and they said, Dan, why are you paying for 2 Netflix subscriptions? I said, I don't know, but I'm going to stop doing that. And thank you, Rocket Money. It adjusts, makes everything in your life easier. It adjusts your spending, right? It gives you, good reasons to save money, to feel more organized and give you a clear picture of your finances day to day. Rocket Money is a personal finance app that helps you find and cancel unwanted subscriptions, just like me. It monitors your spending and helps lower your bills so you can grow your savings. Let Rocket Money help you reach your financial goals faster. Join at rocketmoney.com/lockedon. That's rocketmoney.com/lockedon. All right, welcome back into this edition of Locked On Capitals, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. The best way that you can help grow the show is to subscribe to Locked On Capitals on YouTube, like the videos, and comment anything down below. All right, in the final segment of today's show, we continue to talk about all things Connor McMichael, his value. He's a restricted free agent. Should they try to bring him back? What gives with his up and down, goals and assists the past couple seasons? And now, the final segment here, we talk about the history and the grind. What it took to get Connor McMichael where he is right now. This isn't a former first-round pick that just got shot straight to the moon. This is a guy that had to put the work in. Because the biggest takeaway here from the final segment is Connor McMichael became valuable because his development path was difficult. So let's take the Wayback Machine and rewind this whole thing, because I think sometimes myself, I had to look. I forget, how uncertain Connor McMichael's future looked at one point. Not a smooth development story, not even close. When the Capitals drafted him 25th overall in 19, the offensive talent was obvious immediately. You watch him with the London Knights and you see the high hockey IQ, smart offensive reads, soft hands around the net, playmaking instincts, goal-scoring touch. The production was there, but translating junior offense to the NHL offense is brutal. It is absolutely brutal for a lot of players, and McMichael hit that wall hard. He bounced between Washington and Hershey for years, never fully settling, never fully establishing himself. And if we remember back during that stretch, people absolutely started wondering, is he just another almost prospect, right? And Washington fans have seen that story before. Highly skilled junior scorer, tweener at the NHL level. Can't quite carve out a permanent role. It happens constantly around the league. But McMichael's response is what changed everything. Instead of mentally folding, he kept grinding. That Hershey playoff run, if we think back, was 22-23, became huge, for his developmental arc. 6 playoff goals, massive moments, pressure situations, and the experience gave him confidence, that translated in a big way later. Because after that run, something changed his game. The panic disappeared. The hesitation disappeared. And he finally got consistent NHL minutes back in 23-24. And you started to see stability. Not stardom yet, but stability. 18 goals. 33 points. What I would call a reliable NHL contributor. And then suddenly the breakout season arrives the next year. 26 goals, 57 points. And what's fascinating to me is he did it during one of the loudest seasons this organization, has experienced emotionally, because the entire hockey world was locked onto the Alex Ovechkin chase of Gretzky. And I think a lot of ways that distraction took the limelight off a lot of other players, so they weren't worried about how they look out there. It was just a team collectively pulling on a rope to get Alex Ovechkin over the finish line, if you will. That building had pressure. Cap One every night. Every game felt amplified. And what did McMichael do? He handled it. And it's not nothing. Some young players disappear inside big market pressure. He did not. And honestly, that's why I think this organization trusts him a whole lot more than fans realize, because they saw him survive, all different stages already. The uncertainty, the demotions, the criticism, the inconsistency, right? And now they're watching the payoff, happen in real time. And that is, I think, what makes it exceedingly difficult for Chris Patrick and the Capitals, is what player, if we sign him, are we getting? Are we getting Connor McMichael from a couple seasons ago? Are we getting Connor McMichael from last season? Are we getting Connor McMichael, the one that hopscotched up and down between Hershey and Washington? Who is he? At the end of the day, who is he? That is a tough question that Brian McClellan, Chris Patrick, who's ever going to decide? I know Chris Patrick's the GM, but Brian McClellan kind of still sticks his nose into things and decide, right? And I think that if the Capitals see him have value, then they do like a longer term. I don't think there's any real advantage to me to signing him to a 2-year deal. I know you could make the argument, like I said earlier, about evaluation. However, that is wrought with risk, right? Because if he does, that trajectory starts going up and up. Now you're thinking to yourself, why didn't we sign him to a longer term deal earlier? Because now we're going to have to back up the Brinks truck to his house and maybe he'll, come here. So it is a tough decision, and it's a question. He's a restricted free agent. July 1st is going to be interesting for a lot of different Capitals UFA and RFAs. Tough questions and ultimately exciting. So to wrap up segment 3 here, Connor McMichael's development wasn't smooth enough to become overhyped early. And that may have actually helped him. The grind, through Hershey, the years of uncertainty, the constant need to re-earn a bigger role, a more complete player, and now the Capitals are finally seeing the results. So to wrap up this Connor McMichael episode, Connor McMichael is no longer just a prospect with upside. He's becoming one of the defining players in the Capitals transition era. The contract matters, the role matters, the projection matters, but the biggest question is this. The Capitals finally have a young forward entering his prime who looks capable of carrying real offensive responsibilities moving forward. And that's something. It's something this organization desperately needs. How will the Capitals answer this? Will they trade him? Will they sign him to a bridge deal? Will they sign him to a long-term deal? A tough story for Chris Patrick and the Capitals to have to answer. Listen, once again, I want to thank you for joining me on this edition of Locked On Capitals, your only daily year-round podcast covering the Capitals. And I want to thank all of you that listen on the audio side and watch this on YouTube. You, as a matter of fact, are what makes this show successful. And if you're one of those that never miss an episode, first of all, thank you very much. The Everydayer Club is built just for you. Get Locked On Capitals ad-free plus members-only Discord access and more. Head to lockedoncapitals.supercast.com. There's also a link in the show notes. For those of you on the video side, we send you to the first ever 24/7 National Locked On Podcast Network YouTube channel on audio. Make sure and make your second listen NHL Game Night on Locked On NHL. All right, once again, I want to thank you for joining me on this edition of Locked On Capitals, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, where it is your team every day. My name is Dan Holmi, and I'll talk to you again next time.